other ministers from other ministers is the presence of God that they carry. The presence of God is what reveals to us that God is in our midst. You can put this down or you listen to the message thereafter. The presence of God is the testimony of God's visitation in a place, in a church, in a house, in one's life. The presence of God, the presence of God is this testimony of God's visitation. It testified that God has visited in a place, in a church, in a house, in one's life. In other words, one can host God's presence. A place like a church, for instance, can host God's presence. When there are activities that are going on in a church, that activity can bring down God's presence. It can bring down Christ. It can bring down the Holy Ghost. It can bring down God in our midst. Now, anytime you see the presence, anytime you feel the presence, anytime you sense the presence of God, your optical eyes, your physical eyes, if it is open, you will see God in his invisible form. But the presence is attesting, the presence is testifying that God is what is in our until the Holy Ghost is there. So in verse 1, the Bible said Isaiah praying, because Isaiah understood this principle. He understood this secret of God, that before the presence of God will be felt, before people will begin to experience God's presence, God must come down. In our services, before you begin to feel God's presence, God must descend. And in verse 1, Isaiah speaking, he said, "Oh, that thou wouldest rend the heavens, that thou wouldest what? Come down the same way, Kaltiash. Lepra alatik zezivra akuba latiash. Zekis, there must be a coming down of God by his spirit. There must be a coming down of Jesus by his spirit before you can feel his presence. So the presence is an announcement. The presence heralds the visitation of Jesus. The presence of God heralds the visitation of the Holy Ghost. The presence of God heralds the visitation of God. So you can't experience his presence until he comes down. So there are two things, because the presence of God is the atmosphere of God. God cannot go anywhere without his atmosphere, because the atmosphere is part of God. The presence of God and God himself, they are like identical. They are inseparable. You cannot detach them. They are like identical twins. When you see God's presence, God is there. Even though God is not opening our eyes to see that he's in our midst. So the effect that God is in our midst is this presence that we feel. There are prices to pay. There are sacrifices. God will not just give you his presence if you are not paying the price, because the presence of God's visitation and his presence goes with price, goes with sacrifice. We're going to be looking at that as from tomorrow. But today, what I want to achieve is that I want us to know the difference between God's visitation and his presence, the difference between his presence and God himself. The presence is what announces the visitation of God. I'm re-emphasizing, I'm dwelling on it, so that I want us to have a better understanding. The same way the smell of a mouth, it reveals or announces or testifies to us that there is a mouse in the kitchen. The same way a smoke reveals to us that there is a fire somewhere. The same way the smell of a spoiled beans reveals to us that the beans is spoiled. The same way wind, breeze, the same way air reveals to us and coldness reveals to us that there is a rain. Now, when rain is falling, you discover that you begin to see lightnings and thunderings. Now, the lightning and the thunderings is tied to the rain. There can't be a heavy downfall of rain without lightnings, without thunderings. Now, the lightning and the thunderings is a revelation of the heavy downfall of a rain. The same way the presence of God is the revealer of God's visitation in our meetings, is the revealer of God's visitation in our church, in our churches, is the revealer of God in our own life. A man can host God's presence. A man can host God. God can live in a man. Aside from